Good console is like a good friend. And I just have to say, guys, how many of you have experienced this idea? Now, I'm gonna walk away from our subject at hand for just a second and just say how cool it is that the community, you guys came up with this idea. Because I want to ask you guys a question. When was the last time you felt like you were, like you had a piece of electronic equipment that was part of your family, or that was a good friend to you, or had been a kind of stable and trustworthy, compadre, right? I'm not sure back in the day, that my Commodore was necessarily part of the family. I really loved it. It was a great machine. But at the end of the day, I was ready to move on to the next thing, and I think maybe as children are one to do more so than not, I was ready for the next big thing, and so I just moved on. But now, I like the idea of having a console as a good, close friend. You put attachment to these things sometimes. Maybe it's just geeks, but I don't think so. Where we grow attachments to these things like pieces of electronic equipment. Like people say that you do with certain kinds of cars, right? I know that Volkswagen for many years used this as part of their advertising, right? These are not just great cars, these are cars you're going to fall in love with and you're going to want as a part of your family. If the console really is that, then the life cycle almost becomes irrelevant as well, right? And not to dig too deep into what Backfire was saying with the comment, but the idea of a console really being a friend, a reliable stalwart, in helping you kind of muddle through some of the new innovations in gaming, I think is a really cool idea. And it might be overly romantic, and some of you might be out there saying, my Xbox 360's died twice and I want to throw the thing out the window and not make it a good part of the family. Fair enough. I am not going to argue with you about that one. Trust me. But I'll tell you, it's really cool to see some of these things come to life. I still use my Xbox that I bought, the original Xbox that I bought, then promptly modded and made into a little bit of my own little Frankenstein. Sometime I'll show it to you. It's actually pretty impressive. It's got a nice acrylic case. Anyway, the point is, I still love that machine. And long after it outlives its usefulness, which by the way has still not happened, but when it outlives its usefulness, I will probably gladly display it on the wall rather than destroy it or get rid of it. And it's because that thing has been a great and true friend to me. And so I will keep it for a long time. Not sure I can say that about my 360 yet. I did have a 360 die on me, so I've had two 360s. But I actually just brought one back from the death, and I have to tell you, I just found it, and I thought, hey, this is a great opportunity for me to go save this. And sure, I might have had a couple other ideas like selling it or whatever in my mind, but I got to tell you, I think it feeds right into what Backfire was saying. It felt really good to bring one back to life, almost like I was, giving it a second chance. And maybe I'm reading way too much into it, but I think you cannot speak enough about how these consoles have been a part of our lives. And even if it's only a memory, and even if it's only a piece of our history, I think to some way, it's to some extent, especially those of us that are a little more pack ratish, having that old NES system that you grew up with, that you blew on and that you kind of dusted off and all those kinds of things. And you probably spilled Coke on you with your friends or whatever. I don't know. The point is, having that thing around is still really cool, and I love having those machines around. They are awesome. So I thought that was a great point. I'm not sure it directly speaks specifically to the idea of a 10-year life cycle, except that if a console is part of your life for 10 years plus, then there you go, right? It's a living, breathing part of your life at that point. I haven't had my Xbox since 2001. I've actually only had it since about 2004. But, we're coming right up on a 10-year anniversary for that. That thing's been humming along for 10 years, and it's never failed me once. So there you go, right? That makes it a good, reliable companion. All right, moving on. Astolia. And I think this is also an awesome point. It takes developers a few years to catch up on the software side to what the hardware's done. So all of you were out there, and I think this is really interesting. This is the kind of innovative thinking I love to see in the Weekly Ringer. Almost all of you We're doing the same thing I was doing. We're thinking about this question. We're bickering about hardware specifications. We're talking about graphic capabilities. We're talking about, RAM sizes. We're talking about the capability to be able to push to the next level or dumb down a console port or all these other kinds of things. And then Estolia comes along with something like this that just completely just flies in the face of this, which is basically that when a new piece of hardware comes out, it generally takes developers a few years. And it is years, folks. Just play some of the original games that you bought with some of your hardware. Nintendo does a better job of this, and Estolia makes that point too, because, and Sonic Rose I think made that point later on as well, that Nintendo seems to have the capability to make software for their console better than anyone else does, which is not the case, I would say, for most other, for Sony or Microsoft. I'm not sure Microsoft makes the best games. In fact, I'm almost damn sure they don't. And Sony the same way. So, with the exception of Nintendo, I think you see consoles that, and by the way, Nintendo doesn't have a huge, bleeding edge technology either, so there's something to be said about that. But the point is, when a new piece of hardware comes out, the capabilities are massive. Massive. So, it takes developers a while to learn the systems, to learn the development process, and the cycle that gets involved with developing titles for these consoles. So it takes them a while to figure it out. So you have games that come out that might be really new and flashy, but they just don't compare to games that are 2-3 years down the line, when developers have really had some time to get to know the new piece of hardware and create the experiences that they've been trying to create with them. I think this is a tremendous insight. And with that in mind, let's go back and answer the question. If it takes developers 2 or 3 years to catch up with the hardware, then isn't that a push more toward a 10-year life cycle? Because it took you guys 3 years before you made a game that really showed us what this thing could do. Right? So if it took you 3 years, that means if you got a 10-year life cycle, you got 7 years left to show me what the heck else you could really make this sucker do, right? So, we all know that's probably a little bit, I guess, extravagant. You might see something more like 4 or even 5 years past that 3-year window where things really heat up and they're really great. And I think you could make an argument that we saw the best of what these consoles are capable of last year at E3, and then this year's kind of been a continuation of that. I think everyone knows we're getting into the twilight years of something like a 360 or a PS3, no matter how good these systems are moving, and no matter how many dashboard updates every one of them have taken. The point is that with hardware and software, and again, that synergistic symphony, right? That goes into hardware comes out, people learn to make software for it, the software gets better and better and better, this software is awesome, and then the thing dies, and then we get the next one, right? And we rinse, wash, rinse, repeat, right? I think that's a good point, and I think even then it's hard to imagine a 10-year life cycle for a lot of these consoles, just because it's really, really tough to stretch technology that far, which is another thing that you guys talked about all the time. I want to jump into the next comment by Smoke Pants, which I think is very related, which is the idea that we should really define what the life cycle is and what we really mean by it. Now, when I say life cycle, I mean exactly what Smoke Pants said early on, which is the idea that from the moment a console is released to the moment that its successor arrives. Now that could mean that something like the Dreamcast, which actually does still have some development around it, believe it or not, is still current, is still in its life cycle, and probably will never die, depending on what kind of homebrew community continues around it. But whether it is or whether it isn't, I think that's what people traditionally think of as the life cycle. So the original Xbox was a 2001 to 2005 life cycle, a 4-year life cycle that Microsoft was obviously just trying to get under its belt, learn the lessons, and move on from. Versus, something like an NES, which is, has life to it about 6 years here in America. Actually, probably about 5 years here in America, 6 to 7 years in Japan. The idea that, it starts and stops along those parameters is complicated, and that's why I love what Smoke Pants really brought up. The idea that maybe that's not how we should consider life cycle, because the life cycle of the PS2 seems to be much broader than 10 years already, because the PS2 is one of the most popular consoles in the world even to this day, because of countries that aren't on the bleeding edge of technology. Because active development is so easy to come by on the PS2 now, you can really develop games for the PS2 that don't require the same kind of resources that that newer games require, or to any extent. And so, if we define life cycle with either of those definitions, I think the argument changes, right? And that's exactly what Smoke Pants talks about. The idea of a console life cycle being from the moment it launches to its predecessor launching 10 years seems ridiculous. It seems absolutely ridiculous to us. Because at that point, folks, it's an entire decade. Think about, and many of you did this, think of citing the idea of playing Doom on a Commodore 64. It just couldn't have happened, right? It would have been so watered down and terrible that there would have been no way to enjoy it. And in fact, we needed the hardware to drive the idea of what was possible in software, right? So, here's my point. If you take that symphony again of hardware and software, and you define it more in terms of how long a console is viable, I don't think 10 years is outside of the realm of possibility. It probably it's actually probable, I think, when you come down to it, that a console can last 10 years by virtue of the fact that the experiences keep getting better, the software keeps getting better, so on and so forth. So you guys see what I mean by that, right? And I don't think that's too egregious to be able to say. But I think if we define console life cycle between launch and successor, I don't think we'll ever see 10 years between those. You know, it's not unforeseeable that at the next E3 we will see the launch of the next 360 and the next PS4. Not that we'll see the launch, we'll know the launch window for those systems, and I think it's going to be very exciting. That would make the console life cycles either 7 or 8 years, depending on which console you're looking at. So I think that was a very, very good point, and thank you for bringing that up, Smoke Pants. Enclave, another one of our new folks, mentioned the idea that something I just talked about, which is that the cost of making games has skyrocketed, which cannot be ignored in this equation. One of the reasons that the 360 has continued to do so well is because of the revenue generation that it has outside of its AAA titles. Sure, the AAA titles make a ton of money. There's no question about that. And they are arguably the best platform to get on to be able to experience those AAA titles. However, what I think is undeniable is the revenue stream that Microsoft has seen from the ancillary stuff. They're making more money in DLC. They're making more money in customization. They're making more money in content. They're making more money in downloadables than anyone else is. And that's why I think it's interesting to look at the cost of games. Because before, a console's life was basically decided by the AAA titles that came out for it. I don't think that's the case anymore, folks. And I think this newest E3 here that we just saw really illustrates that fact quite well. It's not at all about the AAA titles anymore. It's not just about the big bad games. It might still be about the games, but it's not just about the big bad games. It's also about the downloadable titles. It's about the indie games. It's about the stuff that is innovative and cool, but not necessarily Activision funded, right? Or, EA, right? It's no longer the big nasty folks out there. It's the little guys coming in, making a splash, having really cool concepts, and that being a $5 to $20 hit versus a $60 hit, right? That is really required to make some of those AAA titles at all lucrative, or else it becomes kind of a losing venture, right? So I think that's a very important point to look at. If we look at the consoles of the future, they're definitely going to have to model what I think Xbox has done. I think the Wii U is going to do this very well, by the way. I think Nintendo's poised very well to do this with the EU. They want to capture that ancillary market share. And I think they'll do a good job of that. So the consoles are going to have to be developed around the idea that it's not just Halo 4 that's going to sell their box. Halo 5, Halo 6, whatever. You guys know what I mean. It's going to be also the Super Meat Boys. It's going to be the Skyrim downloadable